Energy Media readers, today we are going to be talking to lawyer Robert Janes, and he is an expert on indigenous law. And of course, everybody in the country is transfixed by the story of the pipeline blockade in British Columbia and then other protests and blockades throughout the country in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en. And so welcome to the interview, Robert.
Nice to be with you. Although I will say, my work's in Aboriginal law. I always like to defer to my Indigenous brothers and sisters in terms of who's an expert in Indigenous law.
Well, and fair game as well, you should. So let me frame the question like this. I've done an interview with lawyer Kate Gunn, and we talked about how Indigenous law fits into Canadian law and what rule of law means. But I think there's a lot of confusion, a lot of uncertainty around how do we resolve this conflict, this disagreement. And that's what I'd like to do today, is explore some of the strategies. How might the federal government approach this? How might Premier John Horgan, the BC, approach this? Other premiers. So let me toss that out to you just for kind of an overview. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'll be a typical lawyer and say it all depends on what you mean by this conflict. I mean, if you mean by this conflict, the particular conflict that's happening this week in terms of the various blockades and the protests and the camps, and then equivalently the various moves by the RCMP or various, ordinary people who are trying to push through some of these blockades, the solutions there are not easy. It's a little bit like the situation where you have somebody who is in critical condition after a medical condition has been ignored for 2 or 3 years, and suddenly you're saying is, how do I fix this crisis? Because that's what we have in our hands right now, is a bit of a crisis, and that's going to get fixed. In truth, the short-term problems are going to get fixed by exactly what is happening at the various governmental levels right now, by moving cautiously, not giving in to any of the voices for dramatic upscaling in the conflict, and trying to work through with people what it's going to take to open up bridges, roads, train tracks this week. And sadly, some of this will undoubtedly involve conflicts directly with the police. Some of these things will involve, promises to engage in some further processes. And some of these things will involve fixing particular problems, but particulars, who knows?
Well, let's take this angle on it. If I were to ask you, and assuming that you were advising the Wet'suwet'en, and what would be a best case scenario resolution from your point of view and their point of view?
Well, the thing is, I don't act for the Wet'suwet'en, so the truth is I don't know what their point of view is. And of course, the Wet'suwet'en speak with many voices. So, I would say that in the long term, the best possible solution is, first of all, to get the systems in place to actually recognize their governance system, so that we're not sorting this thing out in the middle of a crisis. But also, and this is true across British Columbia, to get the processes in place to start recognizing and figuring out where Aboriginal title is. I mean, the core problem we have today is that the courts have said, one, that there's a lot of land that we call Crown land right now that's not owned by the Crown. It's really owned by First Nations. And second, they've also said, and it may not be the Indian bands that are the government. And so in some cases it may be, in some cases it's not. And we've been bumbling along for 20 years, or since Delgamuukw, really close to 30 years now, hoping to work it out by sort of ad hoc deals. And it's a lot like saying, somebody comes in and takes over your house, and they say, hey, look, we can work out a deal for you to get the tools out of the back shed, but is that good enough for now? When the real problem is you're in my house. So we've known about this problem in a serious way for 30 years, and we've got to get on top of it.
This reminds me in some ways of the discussion we had around the duty to consult after the Trans Mountain expansion approval. The first one was quashed, and then the question becomes, how do how does the Crown fulfill its duty to consult? And constitutional scholars that I talked to said, well, you know what, we haven't done a good job prior to this. We don't really know. We don't have a process. We don't have all of that. And it sounds like we have the same kind of problem here, as you just said. So how do we go about putting in place those processes, to resolve the issues you just talked about?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say is our Constitution actually contemplated constitutional conferences to talk about exactly that. So part of what I would say is let's start off by renewing that process and having some real discussions with the First Nations leadership about that. And to some extent, British Columbia's UNDRIP legislation is a first step down that road. But I would say we can look internationally for some examples. Australia, for example, has implemented a process under the native title legislation, which has a process of figuring out who the traditional landowners are, what land rights they have now, how they should be recognized today. New Zealand has the Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal. In Nicaragua, they implemented a system for recognizing Aboriginal title land. So there's different approaches around the world, and I would say, so talk to the other people involved. Second, look at some of the other systems. A lot of it's going to involve not making the courts the first stop. The problem is right now, the court is the only real way to sort this out. And you're saying to Indigenous people, you've got to go spend $20, $30 million in some cases and maybe get a ruling that's useful.
Let me give you an opinion of mine that I've held for a few years now, and let's see what you think of it. So I do a lot of reporting on the oil and gas industry, and that, of course, means pipelines. And I follow closely the debate around C-69 and talk to a number of executives and so on about the concerns that the government had about opening up the process, bringing in Indigenous traditional knowledge, all of those kinds of things. And they took the view that this would make the process, the environmental review process, unwieldy and unworkable. And my take on that was that no, the only way we're ever going to be able to construct things, whether it's mines or do forestry, whatever, is if we finally resolve this. We finally figure out how to incorporate Indigenous law, incorporate Indigenous communities so that they can have ownership and they can have jobs and they can have prosperity and all that sort of thing. So my take on this is that we need to go in the direction you just talked about in a hurry. And one of the benefits of that will be to international investors, because we need capital for various projects, resource projects. And the message will be Canada is actively sorting out its relationships with Indigenous people so that we can provide certainty around regulatory regimes and so on. Your take, your response, sir.
Well, I always am careful to say finally resolve things, because I mean, we haven't figured out how things work between the federal and provincial government yet. I think we're going to be a long time figuring out the relationship between Indigenous people and the other governments. Look, I don't disagree with the thrust of what you've said there. I mean, the real problem, I won't say my heart bleeds for them, but I do feel a bit sorry for the oil companies, because what we're doing is we're taking a huge societal problem, which is what is the relationship between Indigenous people and the rest of Canada, and we're jamming it into the approval of a pipeline process. And that's because the governments of Canada and British Columbia and Alberta haven't really bothered to take the time to figure out another process. The best thing that could be done to solve many of these problems, at least in the medium term, would be to actually start working on this at a government-to-government level before we get into these fights over particular pipelines. Then companies would know who to deal with, the ground rules would be set in advance. Sure, we'd still have to work Indigenous knowledge into the process itself, but it would not be such an onerous task. But right now, the governments are leaving it to Spectra, to TCPL or TC Energy as it's called now, to Enbridge, to all these companies to figure out the problem of what the relationship is between Indigenous people and the rest of Canada, which is crazy. That shouldn't be their job. That should be our job.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more on that point. And you mentioned earlier that we should return to the constitutional conferences that are set out in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution Act of 1982. So how would you kick that off, and what would be the first topics that should be discussed?
Well, the real power is in the hands of the prime minister and then the premiers to actually bring together such a process. And if I were retained to give some advice about this, is the first topic would be what's going to be the process for getting existing Aboriginal title and rights recognized in some orderly way that doesn't just send us off to the courts in these never-ending battles.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, you mentioned earlier structure and process for a situation that is very unstructured, doesn't have enough process. So I agree with you, and I see this on the duty to consult side of things again, because lawyers have made the point to me, scholars have made the point that the governments have kind of offloaded their consultation duties onto the companies. They've said, well, we don't know how to do this, but you have to consult with them anyway, so why don't you do enough to satisfy our duties as a crown? And so what you're saying, if I understand this correctly, is there needs to be a new political will in Canada at both the federal and at the provincial level to tackle this problem once and for all and resolve it.
Yeah, well, as I said, I'm not optimistic about resolution, but we could get a lot closer to resolution. We could pick areas and start to identify, look, here are areas where we know there's title. Maybe there's peripheral areas where we still have disagreements. Maybe we can agree on what the rules of the roads are for pipelines. Maybe we can agree upon better approaches for what the government should deal with in consultation as opposed to what the company should deal with. It may be that there will still be decades of disagreement, but those disagreements will be much smaller. They'll be much more like the kinds of disputes we've seen between the federal government, the provincial government, or between the provincial government and municipalities. These are things that our system is used to dealing with and we can manage. But right now we've got these huge problems, and the only plan is as I like to say, is to kind of run a Monty Hall game where it's sort of, let's make a deal and hope that somehow a company can come up with enough money or enough goodies or enough treats that that the real problem that we're facing doesn't have to be dealt with.
That's all the questions I have, Robert. Any final thoughts?
Well, my final thought, and I've said this in other places, is that like just saying rule of law isn't really an answer to this problem. Sure, there is a problem that court orders have to be respected. That's a pretty important principle of our legal system. But there's also a principle that says people's rights should be respected too. And we've really set up a process that just works on the basis that we're going to get away with as much as we can get away with without respecting people's rights. And unsurprisingly, the people who are being walked on don't just want to roll over and accept that.
Robert, thank you very much for this. We really appreciate it. And as this story unfolds over the coming weeks and months, I will look forward to chatting with you about it again.
It's a pleasure. Have a good Family Day holiday.